ship left on the dock for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards.
Calling all bibliophiles, I would like to inform you of the drop of a new book. It's an interesting book, especially for your humies, because it proposes the idea that I'm sure all of y'all have thought about at some point or another, that you are, in fact, in a backwater, very hostile corner of the universe. And, well, it starts there. Well, technically it starts when a probe lands on your planet and informs you that you are, in fact, in the worst corner of the universe, and hey, how would you feel about getting out? And so goes the sponsor of this week's episode, otherwise known as Of Dog, Volpir Man. Written by Eric Wesson and just released just this past month on your planet. But seriously, think about it. I mean, think about how your species would respond to a probe landing on your planet at all. I mean, just that core concept. An alien probe landing on your planet alone would be just world-changing for you. But then that probe informing you that, hey, you're in the rough side of town, and then providing you the means to escape that. What would you do? Where would you go? How would you use that information? Well, this book actually explores all of that. And there's some fun little catches along the way that I will leave you to discover when you buy the book and read it for yourself. Anyways, like I said, this episode is sponsored by Of Dog, Volpir Man. And with all that said, and I do say a lot, I feel like this first part should go without saying, but here I am having to say it all the same. I am not, nor have I ever been, a lawyer of any variety. I especially have never been your lawyer. As such, nothing in this episode should be construed as legal advice. It is not intended as such. You should not take it as such, especially since some of the information is probably wrong. That said, did you know that United States federal law is fascinating? Well, that's actually kind of a lie. But what they have still in their federal law system is a little fascinating, just because it makes it awkward for some of the federales in positions in the federal government. For example, 10 United States Code 246 defines a militia as both the organized militia, which constitutes the National Guard and the Naval Militia, and also the unorganized militia, which constitutes the members of the militia who are not members of the National Guard or the Naval Militia, who are able-bodied males who are at least 17 years of age and under 45 years of age. Now, I would argue that various federal laws in the United States of America have decided that males are more or less equivalent to females and vice versa. So this probably applies to both males and females. Congratulations! If you're between 17 and 45, you are in the militia of the United States if you are a resident of the United States. Possibly a citizen. It's not clear whether this law applies to citizens or residents, but still, hey, you're in the militia. Good job for you. Not sure it pays anything, but I guess that's beside the point. And I guess that brings us to perhaps, it totally doesn't bring us to perhaps, 18 United States Code 241. Yeah, this one's a really, really fun one. If two or more persons conspire to injure, oppress, threaten, or intimidate any person in any state, territory, commonwealth, possession, or district in the free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege secured to him by the Constitution or laws of the United States, or because of his having so exercised the same, they shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 10 years or both. And if death results from the acts committed in violation of this section, blah, 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 so on and so forth, they shall be fined under this title or imprisoned for any term of years or for life or both, or may be sentenced to death. Yeah, did you know that the USAians actually had a death penalty built into their system of laws, where if someone tried to make a law that would violate their rights, they could kill them legally? And oh no, it gets more interesting. Because 18 U.S.C. 241 only applies to the conspiracy to attempt to deprive someone of their rights under law. 18 U.S.C. 242 actually applies if you actually succeed to deprive someone's rights under law, and it has basically the same punishment profile. If no one dies, congratulations, you only get 10 years in prison. If someone dies because you deprive them of their rights, great, you can be imprisoned for life or killed. Now, the weird thing is, as far as I can tell, the representatives of the USAian government frequently go out of their way to violate the rights of their subordinates. Their constituents. And this applies whether we're talking about federal regulations or state regulations or whatever. I'm led to believe that federal regulations apply all the way down to whatever municipality you're living in, but honestly, at this point, I'm not sure. But the fact remains that local and state and federal representatives are conspiring absolutely and almost certainly effectively violating the rights of the citizens who live in the United States on a daily basis. And they're not getting prosecuted under this very clear federal law, which really makes me confused about why I'm talking about the next federal law I'm going to be talking about. Because, man almighty, there are a lot of people who are being prosecuted under the law system I'm about to talk about. And it's very confusing given that other people aren't being prosecuted under other very clear laws. Oh, there's a whole separate conversation about that, I suppose. And just to be clear, we will be focusing on 10 United States Code, Chapter 47, otherwise known as the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Now, we are not equipped, and this channel is not equipped, and this episode is certainly not long enough to actually go into the whole nightmare that is a UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice. But it will define and describe and direct a lot of the conversation that you will be hearing in the next however long. Because you see, the Uniform Code of Military Justice is exactly what it sounds like. It is the laws that the military members of the United States live by. Yes, of course, they are still bound by all the federal regulations that would otherwise apply to citizens of the United States, and they are also bound by the laws of the state and city or whatever that they're living in at the time. But really, their first and foremost problem, hurdle, is the UCMJ. Because, you see, to let you in on a little tiny trade secret, perhaps, the UCMJ has priority on almost anything. That is to say, that if an active duty service member in the United States military commits a crime, the military gets the first crack at him. If they're not interested in prosecuting said crime, then they can, on certain various significant regulations, pass that service member back to the civil authorities, and the civil authorities can press whatever criminal charges they like. This does not happen very often. Mostly because the United States military likes handling their legal problems in-house. Which brings us, of course, to office hours, or being ninja punched, or having a non-judicial punishment, which is actually one of the actual appropriate terms, or being Article 15, which of course refers to Article 15 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which refers to non-judicial punishments. Apparently all the various services in the United States like to call this different things, but the name that I know, because of course, well, I've spoken to a lot of sailors, whether we're talking about nautical sailors or space sailors or whatever, is captain's mast. You see, I kind of lied earlier, as I frequently do. The Uniform Code of Military Justice is not the only real law book that military members in the United States should be concerned about. There's also something called the Manual for Courts Martial, and that is basically how actual legal proceedings in the United States military proceed, because, yeah, that's not confusing. And military law in the, actual honest-to-God legal sense, when you actually go up in front of a court, does not significantly differ from civil law. You are tried by a jury of your mostly peers. Okay, it does differ a little. For example, officers are of course tried by a panel of 12 officers. Enlisted personnel are tried by a panel of 12 officers. And if they request, they can be tried by a panel of, 8 officers and 4 enlisted personnel. Yeah, I guess the peers aspect kind of went out the window, didn't it? Oops. But this is not overly dissimilar from the standard state of military members in the military in the United States of America. They surrender all sorts of rights to serve in the military. I mean, they surrender their right to free speech first and foremost. They are not allowed to publicly say bad things about their superior officers, the president, their representatives, basically they're not allowed to say anything about the government. And yes, I know, technically that rule only applies if you're doing it in uniform while you're presenting yourself as a member of the United States military. But let's be honest here. Social media was a mistake in a variety of ways, and one of those ways is getting service members in trouble. I mean, they kind of brought it on themselves. There is a reason why the wardroom and the chief's mess exist, so people can vent about things and discuss things in a community that is at the same tier as them, and you're not ever going to have some rando walk in and, oh goodness, what is going on? And social media is literally the exact opposite of that. But yeah, what do I know? What I do know is that courts martial are the high crime side of the house. They're the felony side of the house. They're the murder and rape and assault and all those other things that you humans have rightfully decided are bad things to do to other people, to the point where the people who do those things should probably go somewhere in a box for a long time. Well, okay, that's courts martial. How do you deal with the smaller stuff? How do you deal with misdemeanors? How do you deal with, say, driving under the influence, or, say, dereliction of duty, or conduct unbecoming, or all the little charges that you can possibly accumulate in your military career that do not rise to the level of the civilian concept of felony, but are still a crime that must be punished? Because courts martial are a little heavy-handed for that, right? Well, allow me to introduce you to Article 15 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, again, otherwise known as Captain's Mast. So first and foremost, we'll actually cover what a Captain's Mast is not. Specifically, it is not a trial, as the term non-judicial might have led you to believe. Secondly, if the captain decides to impose punishment upon you, it is not a conviction. After all, it is not a criminal trial. And finally, if the captain declines to impose punishment on you, which honestly is fairly unlikely, we'll get into why, that is also not an acquittal, because again, not a criminal trial. It is not an official trial in any meaningful sense of the word. Now, the fun part of that, and why I keep harping on it, is since it is not a trial, there are no standards of evidence. And just to give you all some kind of context of what that means, both military law and civilian law has a phrase called fruit of the poisonous tree. Basically, if a police officer does something illegal and discovers evidence that proves that you did something illegal as well, they can't use that evidence in your trial, because they came by that evidence by way of illegal means, and therefore it is literally the fruit of a poisonous tree. It's toxic, it's radioactive. It cannot be admitted at a criminal trial. But, again, captain's masts aren't trials. They have no standards of evidence. You can come by evidence however you like and present it at captain's mast, and the captain will consider it, because that's what a captain's mast is. Are you starting to see how scary this shit is? No, sorry, I keep jumping around, and I guess I should back up. Basically, a captain's mast, or non-judicial punishment, or NJP, is what happens when one of the commanding officers of a group of military personnel has reason to believe that the member of their command has committed minor violations in the eyes of the UCMJ. That can come by either a complaint or a report from military police, or just a commanding officer coming to that conclusion himself. And once the complaint is filed, of course, an investigation must happen to determine whether or not the service member actually violated the UCMJ or not. The investigation is, well, the terms of the investigation are vague. It simply states that there must be an investigation. The investigation could literally be just asking questions of the person who reported the service member and clarifying the situation, and then determining that the service member did actually violate the UCMJ. Again, this is not a trial. There is no witness standard. There is no evidence standard. There are no actual criminal standards, because this is not a criminal trial. This is just convincingly telling a commanding officer that Seaman Schmuckatelli was derelict in his duty enough times that I just can't make the point anymore, so we need to do something about it. Now, once the commanding officer is convinced that there is an actual captain's mast level offense going on here, the service member has to be informed of his rights. Notably that, hey, you're about to be NJP'd. Also, if you want a representative at the NJP, you can have one. The military will not pay for one, which is again an amusing divergence from civilian and actual courts-martial law. Because after all, public attorneys are totally a thing in the civilian court system, and actually are a thing in the military court system as well. Judge advocate generals start out as basically public defenders, and then they move up to prosecutors and so on and so forth. But again, captain's masts are not criminal trials. You can have a representative though, but you are paying for it. You have to go find them, and you have to enlist their services, pun intended. And frankly, most lawyers won't touch NJP cases because there is no case. It is, again, not a criminal trial. You can argue until you're blue in the face, and it won't really matter because there are no standards. And before you ask, most ships do not have judge advocate generals stationed on them. Most bases do have judge advocate generals on the base, but most sailors are typically attached to ships. And ships definitely do have a legal officer, but legal officers are not judge advocate generals. Judge advocate generals are just like lawyers in the civilian world. They have passed the bar somewhere. The United States military does not care where they pass the bar as long as they pass the bar. In fact, most JAGs, as they're called, and I'm sure you know that from that ridiculous TV series, are what's called direct commission officers. They are officers that the Navy or Marine Corps or whomever had sought out in civilian service. They were people who had passed the bar already and were doing good jobs in the civilian world. And the military came to them and said, hey, how do you feel about being a lieutenant in the Navy and skipping all the subordinate grades? Yeah, that actually happens quite a lot in the military. When the military needs specialized services like specific surgeons or specific doctors or specific lawyers, they skip all the lower grades and give them an appropriate grade for the pay. Because realistically, military pay sucks. And if you want to get good people, you have to give them good money. Except military pay is bounded, it is defined, it is limited. So the only way to get them good enough money is to give them a commission that is high enough to get them good enough money. Now, in fairness, these are what's called limited duty officers. They may have a command, quote unquote, that they manage, but they are not unrestricted line officers. They will never take command of a ship or a base or anything military like that. They may command their office, which is them and like 3 other JAGs that work for them, but they are not in the technical military line of succession. So the direct commission, yes, is a shortcut, but it doesn't really get in the way of the day-to-day aspect of the military, aside from the fact that other officers who were commissioned the same day these guys have to salute them, which is, I'm sure, all kinds of weird. Okay, fine. We already covered that they have the right of having a spokesperson on their behalf show up, if they're willing to pay for it. Fine. What are their other rights? They have the right to personally appear in front of the officer imposing the punishment. I mean, at least that part makes sense in terms of civilian law. You have the right to appear in front of your judge. Okay, I guess that makes sense. They also actually have the right to refuse to testify. It is not the same as the right protected by the Fifth Amendment, but it is a right to refuse to testify. They're similar, they're not the same. This is yet another one of those rights that you surrender when you join the United States military. They actually also have the right to present witnesses and evidence on their behalf. They can provide whatever they like to defend their position. Once again, since this is not a criminal trial, this is not a court trial, there are no standards for any of this. They can present character witnesses, they can present material evidence, it doesn't really matter. And they don't have to check it out with anyone but ahead of time. Like in criminal trials, in official actual courts martial, evidence has to be agreed upon by all parties. But no, in NJPs and captain's mass, they can just whip out whatever they want and show it to the captain and say, hey, yea, verily, look at this. I mean, captain doesn't have to care, but we're going to get there. And then another interesting right that subjects of NJPs actually have is the right to request that the NJP be public. Yes, you can actually request that your Article 15 hearing be public to the public. This never happens. But it is a request you can make, and your commanding officer can and will turn it down. I honestly have not been able to find any data that supports that NJPs have ever been public. Because, no. Once again, the United States military likes to handle their legal problems in-house, without Waldorf and Statler doing what they do, right? And then basically the last right afforded to the targets of NJPs, aside from the right to have representative, and we've already gone over that one, is technically the right to request a court-martial. Yes, you actually heard that right. Any person who is subject to a non-judicial punishment, Article 15, Captain's Mass, whatever you want to call it, as long as they are not stationed on a ship that is currently away from home port, they can, in fact, in lieu of the NJP, request a court-martial. They can actually, even before the NJP has been heard, they can appeal it to a higher authority, which of course is a court-martial. This is not a good idea. Because yes, sure, absolutely, courts-martial have all the rules of evidence and all the rules about lawyers and all the rules about representation and this, that, and the blessed other. Can we talk about institutional inertia for just a second? Because, see, I've had the opportunity to have drinks with a number of legal officers who were formerly members of the United States Navy. And I've further had the opportunity to also have drinks with some judge advocate generals who are also in your United States Navy. And let's talk about facts here. The fact is that non-judicial punishment, Captain's Mass, is meant to handle misdemeanor level crimes. And it does not take much to convince a captain that you committed a misdemeanor level crime. Well, great. The same applies to courts-martial, and you might be noticing that I'm referring to them as courts-martial because that's how you say it, but that's besides the point. The real reason that no service member ever appeals NJPs to a court-martial is because a court-martial, if they decide to, can, in fact, since it's probably just a special court-martial as opposed to a general court-martial, and that's a whole separate conversation. But anyways, a special court-martial can give you a bad conduct discharge. This is not the same as a dishonorable discharge because dishonorable discharges only come out of general courts-martial. But a bad conduct discharge, otherwise known as a big chicken dinner, will not make your future life any easier. Whereas, if you just take the licks from your NJP, from your captain's mast, you might recover if you want to stay in. And if you don't want to stay in, well, it's not actually in your record. I mean, yes, your NJP is actually documented in your record, but it's not something you have to disclose to your civilian coworkers or hirers or anything like that. Dishonorable discharges, absolutely, you have to disclose. BCDs, maybe. But you can have multiple NJPs, Captain's Mast, Article 15s, a lot of those, and still get an honorable discharge. So try for that instead, right? Okay, fine. I know, I acknowledge that I've been beating around the bush long enough. What is actually a captain's mast? What does it do? What is the point of it? What happens at that kind of thing? It's honestly pretty short and pretty simple. The captain considers the evidence that is presented to him and then decides whether or not he believes that the service member violated the UCMJ in some fashion or another. And that's it. There's no jury, there's no standards of evidence, there's no deliberation. It typically takes less than 30 of your minutes, and the captain basically renders judgment from his stand, and that is the end of it. The funny thing is you can't even call it a military tribunal because it's just the captain himself. There aren't three people judging the service member. There's nothing. It is literally just the captain considering the evidence and coming to his own conclusions. And believe me when I say this, captains have already made their conclusions when they go into the captain's mast. It's already done. The service member probably doesn't know that, but it is already done. There are a few rare circumstances where the service member brings exonerating evidence that the captain has to reconsider his position, but oh no, once the NJP process proceeds, its outcome is pretty straightforward. Although, honestly, that outcome is something of a complicated linear algebra problem. Individual charges under the UCMJ are actual articles inside of the UCMJ. For example, one of the most favorite articles at any court-martial or non-judicial punishment or captain's mast is Article 92, failure to obey a lawful order. Because I, again, lied a lot. The UCMJ is a legal basis of the United States military when compounded with the Manual for Courts-Martial. There are also miles and miles and miles of standing orders that the service members in any military have to abide by. And if they don't abide by those orders, well, they are failing to abide by a lawful order. Hence, Article 92. These articles typically have some sort of punishment limitation built into them. You can't just go and kill someone because they were delinquent on their debts, for example. But also, commanding officers are limited in what punishments they can impose based on their rank. For example, the minesweepers of the United States Navy used to be a lieutenant command. I don't know if they still are or not, but yes, you are hearing that right. You can be an ensign, you can be a lieutenant junior grade, and then once you're a lieutenant, yes, you could possibly command an actual entire ship. A minesweeper, granted, but still a ship. with crew that you are responsible for. And as a lieutenant, otherwise known as an O3, all they could do at captain's mast was restriction to specific limits for not more than 14 days, extra duties including fatigue or other duties for not more than 14 days, restriction with extra duties for not more than 14 days, correctional custody for not more than 7 days, but only if the accused is in the grades of E3 or below, forfeiture of 7 days base pay, reduction by 1 grade, and an admonition or reprimand, either written or verbal. I mean, okay, so that is what they can do with enlisted personnel. What they can do with officers, well, frankly, officers don't actually come in front of captain's mast, which is, I guess, something I totally glossed past. Officers basically have 2 routes of punishment. They either have written letters of reprimand put in their records, which are functionally career killers, or they go up in front of courts-martial, which also kills your career. The weird thing about your modern United States Navy is that it doesn't have good ways of punishing officers in a non-terminal fashion. Oh, you can have counseling and you can have sidebars and you can have all these other kind of like unofficial things. But the only official reprimands that the United States Navy supports always kill careers. There's no recovery. Whereas on the flip side, for enlisted personnel, captain's mast are kind of considered de rigueur. It's notable if you don't have a captain's mast in your history and you're a senior enlisted personnel. People kind of wonder why you didn't have fun when you were younger. But as I always keep saying, the double standard between officers and enlisted is, yes, a whole separate topic. Anyways, if the commanding officer in charge of the captain's mast is a lieutenant commander or higher, and specifically if they are a captain while simultaneously being the captain of the ship, because, yeah, that happens, their options, assuming the article actually supports it, are restriction for not more than 60 days, extra duties for not more than 45 days, restriction with extra duties for not more than 45 days, correctional custody for not more than 30 days, again, only if the accused is in the grades of E3 or below, forfeiture of 1/2 of base pay for 2 months, reduction by 1 grade if you're a significantly high enough enlisted person, or reduction to E1 straight out if you're E4 or below, or, admonition or reprimand, either written or verbal. And I just want to clarify a few of those specific punishments. For example, correctional custody literally means military prison. Not like Leavenworth or something, but some low security prison. No joke, prison. And one of the writers that the Navy apparently is somewhat unique in, not sure how many other services do this, is that when you send someone to correctional custody, you can literally require them to be on a bread and water diet for up to a week. The Navy, in its infinite wisdom, has decided that bread and water diet should not be extended past a week. But honestly, if you've ever seen what a bread and water diet does to a humie, you know that has meaning. And if you haven't, trust me when I say that you don't want to. And to hit you with that sucker punch right out of the gate, let me hit you with another one. That forfeiture of a half month's pay for 2 months. Yeah, it's a cold hard fact that a lot of these military personnel are in fact using food stamps. They're eligible for it, and the pay is frankly not good enough for whatever families they've decided to take on for themselves. So forfeiting a half of your pay for 2 months is going to make a massive dent in your life. Now, as the military is always fond of reminding you, they did not issue you a family, so supporting that family is your problem. But still, food stamps, and you're cutting off half their pay. That's gonna be a noticeable hit. And then the restriction for not more than 60 days thing, yeah, that means you don't go home. That literally means that you are restricted to the ship or barracks if you are using barracks, a place of worship, the mess hall, and medical facilities, and that's it. You don't go home for up to 60 days. And if that 60 days happens to include when the ship unties and leaves port, you're on the ship from whenever the punishment gets handed down to whenever the ship gets back. It's like being grounded, except you're trapped in a metal box with no Wi-Fi and no privacy, and you might, again, have a family at home worrying about you. Again, the military didn't issue your family, so it's not the military's problem. But still, all of this can be unilaterally imposed on a service member because the captain decided it was a good idea to do it. And the one thing I would love for you to take out of this episode is that is not a bad thing. First off, military criminal proceedings, that is to say courts martial, are terrifying entities. They have no mercy. Even less than your current civilian legal system, because you sure as hell do not have a justice system. They have no mercy. They don't care. If you broke the law, the UCMJ, by rote, then you broke the UCMJ and you will suffer the punishment. Captain's Mass and NJPs and Article 15s and so on and so forth are a way of convincing someone to leave a path before they get to that point. They are the proverbial clue by four with the hope that the obstinate sailor or marine or whatever will get the idea and shape up or ship out. And second, and I know this technically only applies to the United States Navy, but again, as always, I have a weakness for sailors around here. Awkward. Because, of course, shipyard. But still, the captain of a ship is God. What they say goes. Now, amusingly, ironically, troublingly, one of the legal officer's jobs on United States Navy warships is actually to tell the captain of the ship that he is stationed on that he can't do that. Because frequently, captains come into captain's mast wanting to throw the whole UCMJ at the offender. And legal officers, their whole job, one of their whole jobs, is to tell the captain that these are the bounds of the punishment you can impose for this particular offense. You are certainly welcome to impose more punishments, but then you have to explain that to the local judge advocate general and probably defend it legally. And I'm going to put it in writing that I told you that you couldn't do that. Now, the worst part of the whole legal officer concept is that legal officer is a shit billet. It's a secondary job. Like, if you're stationed on a warship as the electrical engineering officer, you might actually be slapped with also being the legal officer. As a butter bar, as an ensign, as an O1. And here you are having to stand up in front of your captain, who is actually a captain, a full honest-to-God 06, so he is literally a captain, and a captain of a ship, and tell him, as an ensign, as a fresh-out-of-college ensign, that you can't do that. Or rather, you shouldn't do that. With the awkward context of, if you do that, I'll tell on you. Because again, that is the legal officer's job. So, sorry, I guess there's a second thing I want you to take away from this episode. And that is to say that the non-judicial system of the United States military is bolstered by fresh out of college dumbasses who don't know what they're doing and who had a 1-month class, if they were lucky, telling their superior officer, the person who decides their future in the military, that they can't do what they wanted to do to Seaman Schmuckatelli, who fucked everything up. And this poor nobody has to be able to stand by that position and explain it to his commanding officer in a way that his probably incensed commanding officer can understand. And then stand by and watch while the commanding officer does whatever the hell it is he's going to do anyways, and pick up the pieces afterwards. But you want to know the scary thing, the truly fundamentally terrifying aspect of all of this? It works. In fact, it's been working in some form or another for 200 years now. I ain't going to say it's a good system, but it does appear to be an effective system. So, with all that said, if you can avoid getting in trouble in the United States military, please do so. It ain't worth the trouble.